Number 1. Charles Manson and the Manson Family. Charles Millis Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old unmarried mother named Kathleen Maddox. His biological father was believed to be a Colonel Walker Scott, though Manson would never know his father, and his mother, who struggled with alcoholism and periods of incarceration, was largely absent from his early life, leaving him to be shuffled between various relatives, boarding houses, and eventually a string of reform schools and juvenile detention centers. By the age of 9, Manson had already begun exhibiting signs of serious behavioral disturbance, stealing, setting fires, and manipulating those around him with a charisma that belied his young age. As a teenager, he escalated to more serious crimes, including armed robbery and auto theft, and by the time he was in his early 20s, he had spent the majority of his life inside various penal institutions across the United States, including the Federal Reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio, and later the United States Penitentiary at McNeil Island in Washington state. It was during these years of incarceration that Manson, who had received only a rudimentary education, began devouring books on psychology, philosophy, religion, and music, teaching himself to play the guitar and developing an obsessive interest in the ideas of Scientology, Dale Carnegie's manipulation techniques, and the apocalyptic Book of Revelation. He also discovered that his uncanny ability to read people and exploit their emotional vulnerabilities allowed him to exert an almost hypnotic influence over fellow inmates, a skill that would later become the foundation of one of the most terrifying cult operations in American criminal history. Manson was paroled in March of 1967 at the age of 32, arriving in San Francisco during the height of the hippie movement, the Summer of Love, when thousands of disaffected young people had descended upon the Haight-Ashbury district in search of community, meaning, and an alternative to mainstream American society. Manson, with his wiry frame, intense stare, and practiced guitar playing, quickly recognized that these wandering, emotionally vulnerable youths were the perfect targets for his particular brand of manipulation, and he almost immediately began assembling what would eventually become known as the Manson Family, a loose-knit communal group that initially centered around music, free love, and communal living but rapidly devolved into an insular, fanatical organization devoted entirely to Manson's increasingly bizarre and paranoid worldview. Among the earliest and most devoted recruits were Mary Brunner, a University of Wisconsin graduate who had been working as a library assistant in Berkeley when she met Manson and abandoned her entire life to follow him, and Lynette Frum, a young woman from Santa Monica who would later become so devoted that she earned the nickname Squeaky and would eventually attempt to assassinate President Gerald Ford in 1975. As the family grew, it attracted a rotating cast of young men and women, many of whom came from middle-class or upper-middle-class backgrounds and had left behind families, educations, and futures to follow this diminutive, charismatic ex-convict who promised them a utopian existence free from the hypocrisy and corruption of mainstream society. By early 1968, Manson had moved his growing flock from San Francisco to the Spahn Movie Ranch in the Simi Hills of Ventura County, California, a sprawling, dilapidated former film set that had been used in decades of Western movies and television shows and was owned by an elderly, nearly blind man named George Spahn, whom Manson and the family essentially took advantage of by providing him with companionship and basic caretaking in exchange for free run of the property. It was at the Spahn Ranch that Manson's ideology began to crystallize into something far darker and more dangerous than the peaceful hippie ethos his followers had initially signed up for, as he started preaching about an impending apocalyptic race war that he called Helter Skelter, a term he borrowed from the Beatles' White Album, which had been released in November of 1968, and which Manson became obsessively convinced contained hidden prophetic messages directed specifically at him and his family. According to Manson's increasingly elaborate and paranoid interpretation, the Beatles were actually angels or messengers sent to warn him and his followers that a cataclysmic racial conflict between black Americans and white Americans was imminent and inevitable, and that during this war, black people would rise up, overthrow the white establishment, and slaughter millions, but would then be unable to govern themselves and would turn to Manson and his family, who had supposedly been preparing, by retreating to the desert, to lead them. This delusional scenario became the central organizing principle of the Manson family's belief system, and Manson began preparing his followers for the violence he insisted was coming by subjecting them to increasingly extreme forms of psychological conditioning, physical deprivation, sleep deprivation, and LSD-fueled ritual sessions designed to break down their individual identities and bind them completely to his will. He also began sending family members on what he called creepy-crawly missions, in which they would break into homes in wealthy Los Angeles neighborhoods at night and rearrange furniture or move items around without stealing anything, purely as a practice exercise for the home invasions Manson was planning and as a way to desensitize his followers to entering strangers' homes while the occupants slept. During this period, Manson also developed a fixation on the entertainment industry, fueled by his belief that he was a gifted songwriter who had been unjustly denied a recording career by a music industry that he felt had stolen from him. Through a series of tangential connections, Manson had briefly met Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, who had picked up several family members hitchhiking and had allowed them to stay at his Pacific Palisades home, where they proceeded to essentially take over the residence, running up enormous bills, vandalizing the property, and terrifying Wilson to the point that he eventually had to forcibly eject them. Through Wilson, Manson had been introduced to record producer Terry Melcher, the son of actress Doris Day, who had briefly entertained the possibility of recording Manson's music before ultimately declining. A rejection that Manson took as a profound personal betrayal and which would later have catastrophic consequences when Manson learned that Melcher had moved out of a particular house on Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon and that a new tenant had moved in. That tenant was the actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant with her first child, the son she was expecting with her husband, film director Roman Polanski, who was away in Europe working on a film at the time of the events that unfolded. Tate, who was 26 years old and had starred in films including Valley of the Dolls and The Fearless Vampire Killers, was spending the evening of August 8, 1969, at the Cielo Drive home with 4 other people, her friend and former boyfriend Jay Sebring, a prominent Beverly Hills hairstylist, Abigail Folger, the 25-year-old heiress to the Folger coffee fortune and a graduate student at UCLA, Wojciech Frykowski, a 32-year-old Polish writer and intellectual who was Folger's boyfriend, and Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had been visiting the property's caretaker and had the misfortune of driving up the driveway at precisely the wrong moment. Shortly after midnight on the morning of August 9th, Manson dispatched 4 of his most devoted followers to the Cielo Drive house with explicit instructions to enter the property and kill everyone inside as brutally as possible, a directive he gave under the pretense that the home still belonged to Terry Melcher, and that the murders would serve as the triggering event for Helter Skelter by making the killings appear to be the work of black militants. Though subsequent analysis by prosecutors and criminal psychologists has suggested that Manson's motivations were likely far more personal and tangled, involving a combination of his rage at the entertainment industry for rejecting him, his desire to demonstrate his power over his followers by making them kill, and his need to externalize the apocalyptic violence that had been building inside his own psyche for years. The 4 family members who drove to Benedict Canyon that night were Charles Watson, a 23-year-old from Texas who had abandoned a promising college career to follow Manson and who would become the primary enforcer and most prolific killer within the group, Susan Atkins, a 21-year-old former cheerleader from San Jose who had been working as a topless dancer when she met Manson and who had become one of his most fanatical and violence-prone disciples, Patricia Krenwinkel, a 21-year-old from Los Angeles who had been a quiet, studious college student before her life was completely derailed by her involvement with the family, and Linda Kasabian, a 20-year-old from New Hampshire who had recently joined the family and brought her infant daughter with her, and who would ultimately become the prosecution's star witness after being the only member of the group to express remorse and refuse to participate in the killings. Upon arriving at the Cielo Drive property, Watson cut the telephone wires leading to the house, and then the group encountered Stephen Parent, who was sitting in his car at the bottom of the driveway preparing to leave. Watson approached the vehicle, and Parent, terrified, begged for his life, but Watson shot him 4 times at point-blank range, killing him almost instantly, making the teenager the first victim of what would become one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history. The group then proceeded up the driveway, where Watson cut through a screen window to gain entry to the main house, and once inside, they subdued the 4 occupants, who had been gathered in the living room, and over the course of the next approximately 45 minutes to an hour, they systematically and brutally murdered all 4 of them in a scene of almost incomprehensible violence and horror. Jay Sebring was shot, stabbed 7 times, and had a rope tied around his neck that was then thrown over a ceiling beam in a grotesque mock execution. Wojciech Frykowski, who attempted to flee and fought back desperately, was shot twice, struck 13 times with a blunt instrument, and stabbed a total of 51 times. Abigail Folger, who also attempted to escape across the lawn, was stabbed 28 times and shot twice, and Sharon Tate, who pleaded desperately for the life of her unborn child, was stabbed 16 times, 5 of which were inflicted after she had already died. Before leaving the house, Susan Atkins used a towel that had been soaked in Tate's blood to write the word pig on the front door, a gesture intended to inflame racial tensions and make the murders appear to be a politically motivated act of black revolutionary violence, exactly as Manson had envisioned. The following night, Manson, apparently unsatisfied with the level of terror the previous night's murders had generated and perhaps sensing that helter-skelter had not yet been sufficiently catalyzed, personally accompanied a group of followers, including Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, and now Leslie Van Houten, a 19-year-old former homecoming princess from Altadena who had dropped out of college to join the family, to a different part of Los Angeles, the Los Feliz neighborhood, where they selected the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a middle-aged couple who owned a successful grocery store chain and had no connection whatsoever to the entertainment industry, to Manson, or to any of his perceived enemies. Manson entered the house first, finding Leno LaBianca asleep on the living room sofa, and at gunpoint, he tied up both Leno and Rosemary, assured them they were only being robbed, and then left the house, instructing Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Van Houten to kill the couple. Leno LaBianca was stabbed 26 times, and a carving fork was driven into his stomach and a knife into his throat, with the words war and death to pigs carved into his abdomen with the knife. Rosemary LaBianca was stabbed 41 times. Before leaving, the killers used the LaBianca's blood to write rise and death to pigs on the walls and helter-skelter on the refrigerator door, further reinforcing the false narrative that the murders were the work of black militants. The murder of Gary Hinman, a music teacher and acquaintance of the family who had been tortured for 3 days in his Topanga Canyon home in late July over money and a perceived slight, during which Manson himself had visited and struck Hinman in the head with a sword, was later connected to the family, as was the killing of Donald Shea, a hand at the Spahn Ranch whom Manson believed was a police informant, and who was beaten and stabbed to death in September of 1969, his body buried in a shallow grave on the ranch grounds. The investigation into the Tate murders was initially assigned to the Los Angeles Police Department's Homicide Division, and the lead detective, a seasoned veteran named Vincent Bugliosi, would not actually be involved at the outset, as the case was handled by a team of detectives who initially pursued numerous leads, including connections to Tate's husband Roman Polanski, drug-related theories given the counterculture milieu of the victims, and various tips from informants. The breakthrough in the case came through a combination of circumstances, including the discovery of the connection between the Tate and LaBianca murders through the similar writing in blood at both crime scenes and the similar method of entry. The arrest of several family members in the weeks following the murders on unrelated auto theft charges at the Spahn Ranch and at a remote desert compound in Death Valley called the Barker Ranch, where Manson and his followers had fled in a desperate attempt to avoid scrutiny, and most critically, the cooperation of Linda Kasabian, who had been present at both the Tate and LaBianca murder scenes but had not directly participated in the killings and who, after being arrested on the auto theft charges, agreed to provide a comprehensive account of the murders to prosecutors in exchange for immunity. Kasabian's testimony, delivered with remarkable clarity and emotional detail, became the backbone of the prosecution's case, as she was able to describe in vivid and devastating detail exactly who had done what at both crime scenes, what had been said, what Manson had ordered, and how the group had planned and executed the attacks. The prosecution of Manson and his followers was handed to Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, a brilliant and tenacious prosecutor who would later write the definitive account of the case in his book Helter Skelter, and who built an extraordinarily complex case that required him to prove not only that the defendants had committed the murders, which was complicated by the fact that Manson himself had not physically participated in either the Tate or LaBianca killings, but also that he had exercised such complete psychological domination over his followers that he was legally responsible for their actions as the principal conspirator who had ordered and directed the killings. The trial of Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten began on June 15, 1970, in the Los Angeles County Superior Court, presided over by Judge Charles Older, and it quickly became one of the most sensational and bizarre legal proceedings in American history, as the defendants engaged in a coordinated campaign of courtroom disruption that included shaving their heads and carving X's into their foreheads, launching into bizarre outbursts and songs during proceedings, threatening witnesses and the jury, and attempting to physically attack the judge and prosecutors at various points. Manson himself, who had initially been permitted to represent himself before that right was revoked due to his disruptive behavior, turned every court appearance into a performance designed to attract media attention and demonstrate his contempt for the legal system, at one point leaping across the defense table with a pencil aimed at the judge's throat before being subdued by bailiffs. Susan Atkins, who had initially confessed to a fellow inmate while being held on the auto theft charges, providing details about the Tate murders that only a participant could have known, initially seemed likely to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a life sentence rather than the death penalty, but she ultimately recanted her confession and joined the other defendants in their disruptive courtroom behavior. The prosecution presented over 200 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence, including the murder weapons, which had been recovered from various locations, including a stream bed near the Spawn Ranch and the Barker Ranch in Death Valley, fibers and fingerprints linking the defendants to the crime scenes, and Kasabian's devastating testimony, which she delivered over the course of 7 days on the witness stand. The defense, for its part, mounted no coherent case, as the defendants refused to cooperate with their own attorneys and instead used the trial as a platform for their ideology, with their court-appointed lawyers struggling to provide any meaningful defense under impossible circumstances. On January 25, 1971, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder against all 4 defendants, and after a separate penalty phase in which the jury heard additional evidence about the defendants' backgrounds and the circumstances of the crimes, they recommended the death penalty for all 4. Charles Watson, who had fled to Texas after the murders and had fought extradition to California for over a year, was tried separately in 1971 and also convicted and sentenced to death. The death sentences for all 5 defendants were commuted to life imprisonment in 1972 when the California Supreme Court, in the landmark case People v. Anderson, temporarily invalidated the state's death penalty statute, a decision that was later reversed by voter initiative but which left the Manson family defendants' sentences as life with the possibility of parole. The broader implications of the Manson family murders were profound and far-reaching, as the killings are widely regarded as the event that effectively ended the idealism and innocence of the 1960s counterculture, demonstrating in the most brutal possible way that the utopian dreams of peace, love, and communal living could be twisted into instruments of horrific violence by a sufficiently manipulative and charismatic leader. The case also had a transformative effect on the Los Angeles Police Department and on criminal investigation techniques more broadly, as it highlighted the challenges of prosecuting crimes committed by groups operating under the influence of a charismatic leader who did not physically participate in the killings. And it led to increased attention to the phenomenon of destructive cults and the psychological mechanisms of coercive control that allows such groups to function. Sharon Tate's mother, Doris Tate, who had been initially devastated by the murders and had retreated from public life for years, eventually became a powerful and influential victims' rights advocate, lobbying successfully for changes to California law that strengthened the rights of victims' families to be present at parole hearings and to submit impact statements. a legacy that has benefited countless crime victims' families in the decades since. Charles Manson spent the rest of his life in California prisons, becoming a notorious figure of morbid fascination who received thousands of letters from followers and admirers over the decades, and who gave numerous bizarre interviews from prison that only reinforced his status as one of the most recognizable and reviled criminals in American history. He died of natural causes at age 83 on November 19, 2017, while incarcerated at Corcoran State Prison, having never expressed genuine remorse for the murders and having maintained his grip on a diminished but persistent following until the very end. Susan Atkins died in prison in 2009 at the age of 61 after being denied a compassionate release request despite suffering from terminal brain cancer. Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten remain incarcerated, having been repeatedly recommended for parole by parole boards in recent years only to have those recommendations vetoed by successive California governors, most recently Governor Gavin Newsom, who cited the extreme brutality and callousness of the crimes as justification for denying parole. Charles Watson, who is now in his late 70s, also remains incarcerated and has been repeatedly denied parole. The Cielo Drive house where Sharon Tate and her friends were murdered was eventually demolished and replaced by a new residence with a different address, but the site continues to attract true crime enthusiasts and morbid tourists to this day. A testament to the enduring and terrible cultural footprint of the crimes committed by Charles Manson and the family he built from the broken dreams and shattered psyches of the young people who followed him into the abyss. The impact on the families of the victims was, of course, immeasurable and permanent, as they were left not only with the loss of their loved ones in the most violent and senseless circumstances imaginable but also with the burden of having those losses played out repeatedly in the media, in books, in films, and in the public imagination for over half a century. A form of secondary victimization that Doris Tate fought tirelessly to address through her advocacy work, and which continues to raise difficult ethical questions about the true crime genre's relationship to the real human suffering at its core. The community of Benedict Canyon and the broader Los Angeles area were also deeply affected, as the murders shattered the sense of security and safety that affluent neighborhoods had taken for granted, and the revelation that the killers were not organized criminals or political terrorists, but rather a group of young, predominantly middle-class people who had been radicalized by a single charismatic figure forced a national reckoning with the question of how ordinary people could be transformed into instruments of extraordinary violence, a question that remains as urgent and unresolved today as it was in the summer of 1969. Number 2. Shoko Asahara and Aum Shinrikyo. Chizuo Matsumoto was born on March 2, 1955, in a remote and impoverished area of Kumamoto Prefecture on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, the seventh of 9 children born to a family of poor tatami mat makers who lived in a small, drafty house with dirt floors and no running water. A background of extreme deprivation that would later be heavily mythologized and distorted by Asahara himself as he constructed the elaborate origin story that formed the foundation of his spiritual persona. From birth, Matsumoto suffered from infantile glaucoma in both eyes, a condition that left him partially blind and required him to attend a school for the blind in nearby Kumamoto City, where he was reportedly a difficult and sometimes aggressive child who bullied other students and displayed an outsized need for attention and control that set him apart from his peers. Despite his visual impairment, Matsumoto was reportedly ambitious and charismatic even in his youth, though his academic record was unremarkable, and after graduating from the School for the Blind, he moved to Tokyo in the late 1970s with the intention of studying acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, which were common career paths for visually impaired people in Japan at the time. Though he would eventually drop out of the acupuncture school he attended and drift through a series of failed business ventures, including a traditional Chinese medicine shop and an electronics store, both of which failed, leaving him with mounting debts and a growing sense of frustration with mainstream society that would eventually find its outlet in the spiritual and religious marketplace of 1980s Japan. It was during this period of drifting and searching that Matsumoto began to immerse himself in the study of various esoteric and religious traditions, including Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Christianity, and the writings of Nostradamus, whose prophecies of apocalyptic world war would become a central element of his later teachings. In 1984, Matsumoto formally established a small yoga and meditation group in a one-room apartment in the Shibuya ward of Tokyo, which he initially called Aum Shinsen no Kai, or the Group of the Divine Immortals, and which attracted a modest following of approximately 15 members who were drawn to Matsumoto's intense personality, his claims of having achieved various states of spiritual enlightenment, and his promise that through the practice of specific yoga techniques and meditation they could develop supernatural powers including levitation, clairvoyance, and the ability to cure illness. In 1985, Matsumoto traveled to India, where he claimed to have studied under a Tibetan Buddhist master named Khenpo Karma Gyaltsen and to have achieved the state of ultimate enlightenment, claims that were later investigated and found to be almost entirely fabricated, as the monk in question denied having any significant relationship with Matsumoto, but which served the crucial function of providing Matsumoto with the spiritual credentials he needed to legitimize himself as a religious leader in the eyes of his Japanese followers, who had no way to independently verify his claims. Upon returning to Japan, Matsumoto formally changed his name to Shoko Asahara, a name derived from a combination of characters meaning true light and morning sun, and reorganized his growing movement under the name Aum Shinrikyo, which combined the Sanskrit word Aum, a sacred syllable representing the universe in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, with the Japanese word Shinrikyo, meaning supreme truth religion. And he began aggressively recruiting new members, targeting particularly the elite universities of Japan, including the University of Tokyo, Kyoto University, and the Tokyo Institute of Technology, where he found that highly intelligent but often socially isolated and spiritually searching students were receptive to his blend of Eastern mysticism, apocalyptic prophecy, and promises of supernatural advancement. The appeal of Aum Shinrikyo to these young, educated Japanese was multifaceted and deeply rooted in the social and economic conditions of late 20th century Japan, a society that, despite its extraordinary post-war economic success, had produced a generation of young people who felt alienated by the rigid corporate hierarchy, the intense pressure to conform, and the spiritual emptiness that many perceived beneath the surface of Japan's material prosperity, and Asahara skillfully positioned his movement as an alternative to this soulless mainstream existence, offering a community of like-minded seekers, a clear spiritual path, and the intoxicating promise that they were not ordinary people but rather an elect group destined to survive and transcend the coming apocalypse. As the organization grew throughout the late 1980s, expanding from a small Tokyo apartment to a network of centers across Japan and eventually acquiring property in rural areas where large communes could be established, Asahara began to implement an increasingly rigid and hierarchical organizational structure that mirrored in many ways the structure of a government or a military organization, with himself at the absolute center as the supreme guru whose word was law and whose authority could not be questioned, and he established a system of ranks and titles, with senior disciples given positions of authority over lower-ranking members, and he introduced a system of initiation rituals that progressively deepened the members' commitment and dependence on the organization, including the controversial practice of donating one's entire assets to the group upon joining, a requirement that effectively severed the members' ties to the outside world and made leaving the organization extraordinarily difficult both practically and psychologically. The first major crime committed by Aum Shinrikyo, and the one that established the pattern of violence that would eventually escalate to the subway attack, was the murder of Tsutsumi Sakamoto, a 33-year-old lawyer who had been working on behalf of parents of Aum members who were trying to rescue their children from the organization, and who had been aggressively investigating the group's practices, including the forced donations, the physical abuse of members, and the illegal confinement of members who expressed a desire to leave. Sakamoto had filed a formal complaint against Aum Shinrikyo with the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, and was in the process of preparing a lawsuit that threatened to expose the group's criminal activities to public scrutiny, a development that Asahara perceived as an existential threat to his organization and to his own freedom. And he reportedly ordered the elimination of Sakamoto and his family in a meeting with his inner circle in October of 1989. On the night of November 3, 1989, A team of 5 AUM members, including high-ranking lieutenants, drove to Sakamoto's apartment in Yokohama, where they encountered not only the lawyer but also his 29-year-old wife Satoko and their 14-month-old son Tatsuhiko, and in an act of cruelty and ruthlessness that shocked even seasoned investigators when the full details later emerged. The AUM team murdered all 3 members of the Sakamoto family, strangling the adults, and poisoning the infant with potassium chloride before transporting the bodies to 3 separate locations in rural Niigata, Toyama, and Nagano prefectures, where they were buried in shallow graves in a deliberate effort to ensure that the bodies would never be found and that the murders would remain unsolved. The Sakamoto family disappearance became one of the most famous missing persons cases in Japanese history, generating enormous media attention and a massive police investigation that, despite its scale and intensity, failed to locate the bodies or identify any suspects for over 5 years. A failure that was later attributed to the police's inability to conceive of a religious organization being capable of such systematic violence, an investigative blind spot that would have catastrophic consequences when AUM Shinrikyo escalated its criminal activities in the years that followed. Emboldened by the success of the Sakamoto murder in eliminating a perceived threat without detection, Asahara and his inner circle began to expand the scope and scale of the organization's criminal operations in ways that were both increasingly violent and increasingly sophisticated. As AUM Shinrikyo evolved from a manipulative and abusive religious cult into what was essentially a rogue state within the borders of Japan, complete with its own chemical and biological weapons programs, its own intelligence apparatus, its own internal security force, and its own system of secret prisons where dissident members were tortured and sometimes killed. The decision to develop chemical and biological weapons was driven by Asahara's escalating apocalyptic beliefs, which by the early 1990s had become centered on the conviction that a cataclysmic world war, prophesied in part by Nostradamus and in part by Asahara's own claimed clairvoyant visions, was imminent, and that AUM Shinrikyo had a sacred duty to prepare for this war by acquiring the means to defend itself and to strike at the enemies who were conspiring to destroy the true faith. A category that eventually came to include the Japanese government, the Japanese legal system, the mainstream media, and various religious organizations that Asahara viewed as competitors or adversaries. To build his weapons program, Asahara recruited highly educated scientists and engineers from among his followers, including graduates of Japan's most prestigious universities in fields such as chemistry, physics, biochemistry, and chemical engineering, and he provided them with enormous financial resources, which the organization accumulated through the forced donations of members, the operation of various profitable businesses including computer companies and restaurants, and a sophisticated system of fraud and extortion that generated millions of dollars in revenue. The AUM Shinrikyo chemical weapons program was established at a number of secret facilities, including a compound in the remote mountains of Yamanashi Prefecture near Mount Fuji and a facility in the Gunma Prefecture town of Kamakushiki, where scientists working under the direction of a key lieutenant named Seiichi Endo, who held a graduate degree in virology from Kyoto University, began experimenting with a range of biological agents including botulinum toxin, anthrax, and Q fever, as well as chemical agents including sarin, the deadly nerve agent originally developed by German scientists in the 1930s and later weaponized by various nations during the Cold War. The sarin production effort was led by Masami Tsuchiya, a 30-year-old chemist who had graduated from the University of Tokyo with a degree in applied chemistry and who had worked for a major Japanese chemical company before joining AUM, and who was able to use his professional knowledge and the organization's substantial financial resources to establish a sarin synthesis operation that, while crude by military standards, was capable of producing quantities of the nerve agent sufficient for mass casualty attacks. Before the subway attack, AUM Shinrikyo conducted at least one prior sarin attack that served as a test run and also as an act of retaliation against specific individuals who had opposed the organization, and this was the June 27, 1994, sarin attack in the city of Matsumoto in Nagano Prefecture. An incident that was initially misidentified by investigators as a toxic chemical accident, and that was not definitively linked to Aum Shinrikyo until after the subway attack. The Matsumoto attack was directed at 3 judges who were scheduled to rule on a real estate dispute involving Aum Shinrikyo, and the sarin was released from a converted refrigeration truck parked near the judge's apartment complex, dispersing a cloud of the nerve agent that drifted over the surrounding neighborhood, killing 7 people and injuring approximately 600 others, making it one of the deadliest acts of domestic terrorism in Japanese history even before the subway attack. Despite the scale of the Matsumoto attack, the investigation was severely mishandled from the outset, as local police and medical authorities initially focused their suspicions on a local resident named Yoshiyuki Kuno, who had been storing agricultural chemicals and who became the target of intense media scrutiny and public vilification that destroyed his reputation and his health. A tragic miscarriage of justice that was only corrected years later when Aum's responsibility for the attack was conclusively established. The failure to identify Aum Shinrikyo as the perpetrator of the Matsumoto attack was a catastrophic error that allowed the organization to continue operating its weapons programs and planning further attacks without interference for nearly 9 months, a period during which Asahara and his inner circle, alarmed by the increasing scrutiny the organization was facing from the media and from a small number of dedicated investigators, decided to launch a dramatically escalated attack that would demonstrate Aum's power and throw the Japanese government into chaos at a time when Asahara believed the apocalypse was rapidly approaching. The target chosen for this attack was the Tokyo subway system, one of the busiest and most symbolically important pieces of infrastructure in Japan, used by millions of commuters every day and representing the pulsing heart of the nation's capital and its economic and political life. And the plan was to release sarin gas simultaneously on multiple subway lines during the morning rush hour on Monday, March 20, 1995, a date that was chosen for its astrological and numerological significance within Asahara's esoteric belief system. On the morning of the attack, 5 teams of 2 Aum members each, all of whom had been selected for their loyalty and their willingness to die for the cause, boarded 5 separate trains on 3 different subway lines that all converged on the central Tokyo stations near the government district in Kasumigaseki, each team carrying 2 or 3 plastic bags filled with approximately 900 milliliters of liquid sarin each, which they had prepared the night before at the Kamakura-shiki compound and transported into Tokyo in briefcases and backpacks. The method of dissemination was deliberately simple and low-tech, reflecting both the practical constraints of operating in a crowded public space and Asahara's belief that the attack should be carried out in a way that maximized fear and confusion, and the teams were instructed to place the sarin-filled bags on the floors of the subway cars, puncture them with sharpened umbrella tips, and then exit the trains at the next station, allowing the liquid sarin to evaporate and spread through the enclosed subway cars and stations as the trains continued moving through the network. The attack began at approximately 7:48 in the morning, and within minutes, passengers on the affected trains and in the affected stations began experiencing the horrific symptoms of sarin exposure, which include constricted pupils, severe eye pain, blurred vision, runny nose, chest tightness, difficulty breathing, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions, loss of consciousness, and in cases of severe exposure, death through respiratory failure caused by the paralysis of the muscles. Controlling breathing, as sarin works by irreversibly inhibiting the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is essential for the proper functioning of the nervous system, causing a catastrophic buildup of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine that sends the body's muscles and glands into uncontrollable overdrive. The scenes that unfolded in the Tokyo subway system that morning were among the most horrifying ever witnessed in a modern developed nation, as thousands of commuters suddenly found themselves gasping for air, collapsing on platforms, convulsing on train floors, and stumbling blindly through stations with their vision deteriorating and their lungs failing, creating scenes of chaos and suffering that were witnessed by millions of people through live television coverage that began broadcasting within hours of the attack. First responders, including subway workers, police officers, and firefighters, arrived at the scene without any knowledge of what they were dealing with and without any protective equipment, and many of them were themselves exposed to sarin while trying to assist the victims, further compounding the casualty count and the confusion, as hospitals across Tokyo were overwhelmed with thousands of patients arriving simultaneously, many of whom were unable to breathe, unable to see, and in many cases dying in emergency rooms and corridors that were completely unequipped to handle a mass casualty event involving a chemical weapon. In the end, the Tokyo subway sarin attack killed 13 people outright, though the death toll would eventually rise to 14 as additional victims succumbed to the long-term effects of sarin exposure in the months and years that followed, and it injured approximately 6,300 people, making it by far the deadliest terrorist attack in Japanese history and one of the most devastating acts of chemical terrorism ever perpetrated anywhere in the world. The investigation into the subway attack was massive in scale and was led by the National Police Agency, which established a special task force that eventually grew to include over 3,000 investigators, and the initial breakthrough came remarkably quickly, as police identified the plastic bags used to carry the sarin as products sold primarily by a specific camping goods store. And they were able to trace purchases of these bags to Aum Shinrikyo facilities through store records. Within days of the attack, thousands of police officers raided Aum Shinrikyo facilities across Japan, including the massive Kamakushiki compound near Mount Fuji, where they discovered staggering evidence of the organization's weapons programs, including large quantities of chemicals used in sarin production, laboratory equipment, documents detailing the synthesis of various chemical and biological agents, and evidence of the organization's involvement in numerous prior crimes including the Sakamoto murders, the bodies of the Sakamoto family having been discovered in their separate graves just days before the subway attack, in a development that added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible situation. Shoko Asahara was found hiding in a small, specially constructed room within the Kamakushiki compound on May 16, 1995, nearly 2 months after the subway attack, and was arrested without incident, though he reportedly appeared disoriented and incoherent at the time of his arrest. A condition that some observers attributed to the effects of long-term drug use and others to a deliberate strategy of feigning mental illness to avoid prosecution. The trial of Shoko Asahara was one of the longest and most complex criminal proceedings in Japanese legal history, spanning over 7 years from its beginning in April 1996 to its conclusion with a guilty verdict in February 2004, during which time Asahara refused to speak coherently in court, muttering incomprehensibly, staring blankly, and generally behaving in a manner that his lawyers argued demonstrated mental incompetence to stand trial, though the court appointed psychiatric experts who examined him ultimately concluded that he was faking his mental condition and was fully aware of the proceedings and their significance. The prosecution presented an overwhelming body of evidence, including testimony from former Aum members who had defected from the organization and who provided detailed accounts of the inner workings of the group, the weapons programs, and Asahara's direct role in ordering and directing the various criminal acts, as well as physical evidence including the chemical production facilities, the sarin residue, the documents detailing the planning and execution of the attacks, and the testimony of victims and first responders who described the horrors they had experienced. On February 27, 2004, the Tokyo District Court found Shoko Asahara guilty on 13 counts of murder, including the Sakamoto family murders and the subway attack, as well as numerous other charges including attempted murder, kidnapping, and violations of chemical weapons laws, and sentenced him to death by hanging. Asahara's appeal was rejected by the Tokyo High Court in 2006 and by the Supreme Court of Japan in September 2006, and he was executed by hanging at the Tokyo Detention House on July 6, 2018, at the age of 63. Along with 6 other senior Aum Shinrikyo members who had also been sentenced to death, including Seiichi Endo, the virologist who had overseen the biological weapons program, and Masami Tsuchiya, the chemist who had directed the sarin production. In total, 13 Aum Shinrikyo members were sentenced to death for their roles in the various crimes committed by the organization, and all 13 have been executed, with the final executions carried out in July 2018. 6 additional members received life imprisonment sentences, and many others received shorter prison terms for their involvement in various aspects of the organization's criminal activities. The broader implications of the Aum Shinrikyo case were profound and continue to reverberate not only in Japan but around the world, as the case demonstrated with terrifying clarity that a non-state actor, even one operating within a developed democratic nation with sophisticated law enforcement and intelligence capabilities, could acquire and weaponize chemical agents of mass destruction and deploy them against civilian populations in a manner that caused casualties on a scale previously associated only with military operations. The case exposed critical failures in Japan's intelligence and law enforcement apparatus, which had been aware of Aum Shinrikyo's suspicious activities for years but had failed to take decisive action, in part because of legal restrictions on surveillance of religious organizations and in part because of an institutional reluctance to believe that a religious group could pose a genuine threat to national security. A failure that was directly analogous to the intelligence failures that preceded the September 11th attacks in the United States 6 years later, and that has been extensively studied by counterterrorism experts and intelligence agencies around the world as a case study in the dangers of failing to connect dots and act on available information. The Aum Shinrikyo case also forced a global reckoning with the question of how to balance religious freedom and civil liberties with the need to monitor and intervene in the activities of groups that may be using the protections afforded to religious organizations as cover for criminal and terrorist activities, a tension that remains one of the most challenging and contentious issues in counterterrorism policy to this day. In Japan, the case led to significant legal reforms, including the passage of the Anti-Subversive Activities Law, which provided the government with new tools for monitoring and restricting organizations deemed to pose a threat to public safety, and it led to a thorough overhaul of the Japanese police and intelligence services' approach to counterterrorism, including the establishment of specialized units dedicated to monitoring potential threats from extremist groups of all kinds. For the victims of the subway attack and the Matsumoto attack, the physical and psychological consequences were devastating and enduring, as many of the approximately 6,000 people who were exposed to sarin suffered from long-term health effects including chronic respiratory problems, neurological damage, vision impairment, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and many were unable to return to work or to live normal lives in the years and decades following the attacks. A support organization called the Association of the Victims of the Sarin Gas Attack on the Tokyo subway system was established to provide medical, psychological, and legal assistance to the victims and their families, and the group has been instrumental in advocating for the rights of terrorism victims in Japan. Though many victims have expressed frustration at what they perceive as the inadequate level of government support and compensation, particularly in comparison to the support provided to victims of natural disasters such as the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. The Aum Shinrikyo organization, despite the execution of its leader and the imprisonment of its most senior members, did not completely disappear after the subway attack, as a remnant of the group rebranded itself under the name Aleph and later under the name Hikari no Wa, or Circle of Rainbow Light, and continues to operate in Japan and in several other countries under the supervision of government-appointed monitors, though its membership has dwindled from a peak of approximately 10,000 in the mid-1990s to an estimated 1,500 or fewer today, and the group has publicly renounced violence and distanced itself from Asahara's teachings. The persistence of the remnant organization has been a source of ongoing anxiety and frustration for the victims and for the Japanese public, and there have been periodic calls for the group to be completely disbanded, though the government has thus far maintained that continued monitoring is a more effective approach than outright prohibition, which could drive the group underground and make it harder to track. The impact on the families of Aum Shinrikyo members was also devastating, as thousands of parents, siblings, and children of cult members were left to grapple with the incomprehensible reality that their loved ones had been drawn into an organization that committed mass murder, and many of these families spent years and in some cases decades trying to extract their relatives from the group, often at enormous emotional and financial cost, and many have spoken about the particular anguish of watching bright, educated, and compassionate young people transform into fanatical followers of a man who ordered the deaths of innocent people, including infants, in the name of a bogus spiritual ideology. The Tokyo subway sarin attack remains a defining event in contemporary Japanese history, a moment when the nation's sense of safety and normalcy was shattered in the most brutal and public way imaginable, and it continues to serve as a powerful and sobering reminder of the capacity for extreme violence that can emerge from the intersection of charismatic leadership, apocalyptic ideology, and technical capability, a combination that is if anything more dangerous today than it was in 1995 given the proliferation of scientific knowledge and the global reach of extremist ideas through the Internet. The lessons of Shinrikyo, about the dangers of complacency, the importance of early intervention, the need for effective intelligence sharing, and the terrible human cost of allowing destructive cults to operate unchecked, are lessons that the world has not yet fully learned, and the names of the 13 people who died on the morning of March 20, 1995, and the 7 people who died in Matsumoto, and the 3 members of the Sakamoto family who were murdered in their home in the middle of the night, deserve to be remembered not only as victims of a particular act of terrorism but as a permanent warning about the depths of human depravity that can be reached when charisma, ideology, and technology are combined in the service of evil. Number 3. Adolfo Constanzo and the Narco-Satanist Cult. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was born on November 1, 1962, in Miami, Florida, to a Cuban mother named Delia Aurora González del Valle, who had fled the Cuban Revolution and settled in Miami, where she worked as a fortune teller and practitioner of Santeria and Palo Mayombe, Afro-Caribbean religious traditions that blend elements of West African spiritual practices with Catholicism, and which involve rituals that can include animal sacrifice, spirit invocation, and the use of altars containing sacred objects including human bones, a spiritual environment in which the young Constanzo was immersed from the earliest moments of his life and which would profoundly shape his psyche and his understanding of the relationship between violence, power, and the supernatural. Constanzo's biological father was reportedly a man named Adolfo Constanzo, about whom little is known, and the boy was raised primarily by his mother and by a series of her male partners, one of whom, a man named Aurelio Perez, reportedly introduced the young Constanzo to the darker and more esoteric elements of Palo Mayombe, a tradition that, unlike Santeria, is explicitly focused on the manipulation of dark spiritual forces called Nkisi through rituals that can include not only animal sacrifice but in some extreme interpretations, human sacrifice, a distinction that is critical to understanding the trajectory of Constanzo's life and the crimes he would eventually commit. As a teenager growing up in Miami in the 1970s, Constanzo was widely recognized as an unusually charismatic and intelligent young man who possessed an almost magnetic ability to attract and influence people, but he was also visibly unstable, prone to sudden outbursts of violence, and deeply immersed in the world of occult practices that his mother had introduced him to. Spending countless hours studying Palo Mayombe, Santeria, and various other esoteric traditions, and beginning to develop the personal mythology that he would later use to establish himself as a powerful spiritual figure. By the time he was in his late teens, Constanzo had begun presenting himself to others as a palero, or practitioner of Palo Mayombe, with extraordinary powers, claiming that he could communicate with the dead, predict the future, curse enemies, and provide supernatural protection to those who paid for his services, claims that found a ready audience among the large and diverse Latino community in Miami. Where belief in various forms of folk Catholicism and Afro-Caribbean spirituality was widespread and where there was no shortage of desperate people willing to pay for any advantage, spiritual or otherwise, in a city that was during this period a major center for the international drug trade. In 1983, at the age of 21, Constanzo committed his first known homicide, shooting and killing a former business partner named Alfredo Machado during a dispute at a Miami warehouse, a crime for which he was arrested but which ultimately resulted in the charges being dropped after the key witness failed to appear in court. An outcome that Constanzo reportedly attributed to his own supernatural powers, and which reinforced his growing belief that he was untouchable and that the spiritual forces he invoked would protect him from any earthly consequences for his actions. Following the dismissal of the murder charges, Constanzo, who was increasingly concerned about possible retaliation from associates of his victim and who was also seeking to expand his spiritual business into new and more lucrative markets, relocated to Mexico City in 1984, where he quickly established himself within the city's thriving underworld as a powerful and feared brujo, or sorcerer, whose services were sought after by drug traffickers, corrupt police officers, and politicians who believed that Constanzo's rituals could provide them with supernatural protection from their enemies, ensure the success of their criminal enterprises, and help them eliminate their rivals through curses and hexes. It was in Mexico City that Constanzo's particular brand of spiritual practice, which blended elements of Palo Mayombe, Santeria, Aztec ritual sacrifice, and his own invented mythology, began to crystallize into something genuinely new and genuinely terrifying, as he started to incorporate human sacrifice into his rituals, a practice that, while not sanctioned by any mainstream tradition of Palo Mayombe or Santeria, was justified by Constanzo through his interpretation of certain esoteric texts, and his claims that certain powerful spirits, specifically the Nana or Prenda, which is the central altar and spiritual vessel in Palo Mayombe, required the energy of a human life to achieve maximum potency. Constanzo assembled a dedicated inner circle of followers who served as his lieutenants, enforcers, and ritual assistants, and this group eventually became known to investigators and the media as the narco-Satanists, a term that captured both their connection to the drug trafficking underworld that provided their primary source of income and clients, and the dark spiritual ideology that motivated their increasingly extreme acts of violence. Among the most important members of Constanzo's inner circle were Martin Quintana Rodriguez, a Cuban man who served as Constanzo's primary enforcer and who was reportedly involved in numerous murders, Sarah Maria Aldrete Villarreal, a young Mexican woman from a middle-class family in Tijuana who had been a college student studying psychology before being drawn into Constanzo's orbit, and who would eventually be known as La Madrina, or the Godmother, within the cult, serving as a senior lieutenant and ritual participant, and Jorge Luis Monra Martinez, who was known as El Dubi and who served as a trusted aide and enforcer. As Constanzo's reputation grew within the Mexican drug underworld throughout the mid-1980s, he attracted an increasingly prominent and wealthy clientele, including several high-ranking members of the Gulf Cartel, one of Mexico's most powerful drug trafficking organizations, which was then engaged in a bitter and violent conflict with rival cartels for control of lucrative drug trafficking routes into the United States. And these drug lords turned to Constanzo not only for spiritual protection but also for practical assistance in eliminating their rivals, a service that Constanzo was more than willing to provide, as it allowed him to combine his spiritual ambitions with the financial and logistical resources of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Americas. The relationship between Constanzo and the Gulf Cartel became increasingly symbiotic and increasingly dangerous, as the drug traffickers provided Constanzo with money, weapons, and protection, while Constanzo provided them with rituals that he claimed would make them invincible and with the services of his loyal followers as assassins who could carry out killings with a level of brutality that served as both a practical tool for eliminating rivals and a terrifying demonstration of the spiritual power that Constanzo claimed to wield. By 1988, Constanzo had moved his operations from Mexico City to the border city of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, which sits directly across the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas, and which was a major hub for drug trafficking activity controlled by the Gulf Cartel, and it was in Matamoros that the cult established its primary base of operations, a compound known as the Rancho Santa Elena, which was located on the outskirts of the city and which served as both a ritual site and a storage facility for drugs and weapons. It was also in Matamoros that Constanzo's ritual killings escalated dramatically in frequency and severity, as the cult began abducting people, primarily from the poorest and most marginalized segments of Matamoros society, including prostitutes, homeless people, and drug addicts, individuals whose disappearances were unlikely to generate significant police attention or public outcry, and sacrificing them in elaborate Palo Mayombe rituals that involved torture, mutilation, and the extraction of specific body parts, including brains, blood, and spinal columns, which Constanzo believed were necessary to feed and empower the Nana and to provide maximum supernatural protection to his drug cartel clients. The exact number of people murdered by Constanzo's cult during this period is unknown, but investigators later estimated that at least 23 people were killed in ritual murders between 1983 and 1989, though the actual number may be significantly higher. As many of the victims came from populations whose disappearances were not systematically tracked by Mexican law enforcement, and whose bodies were disposed of in ways that made identification and recovery extremely difficult, including burial in unmarked graves on the Rancho Santa Elena property and disposal in bodies of water. The crime that finally brought Constanzo and his cult to the attention of international law enforcement and the global media was the abduction and murder of Mark Kilra, a 21-year-old pre-med student at the University of Texas at Austin who had traveled to Matamoros with friends during spring break in March of 1989 and who had last been seen alive in the early morning hours of March 14, 1989, as he was walking alone near the border crossing after becoming separated from his friends in a crowded bar. Kilra's disappearance generated an immediate and intense response from U.S. law enforcement, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Texas Department of Public Safety, as well as from Kilra's family, who launched a high-profile public campaign to find their son, a campaign that was fueled by the widespread assumption in the United States at the time that a missing American college student in a Mexican border town had almost certainly been kidnapped by drug traffickers, a scenario that, while grim, was at least comprehensible within the familiar framework of narco-violence that characterized U.S. media coverage of the U.S.-Mexico border. What the investigators did not initially know, and what would eventually emerge as one of the most shocking elements of the case, was that Kilra had been abducted not for ransom and not because of any connection to the drug trade, but specifically because Constanzo had decided that a tall, blonde, blue-eyed American with light skin would be the most powerful possible sacrifice for an upcoming ritual that he believed would provide supernatural protection for a major drug shipment that the Gulf cartel was planning, a calculation that reflected both Constanzo's twisted interpretation of Palo Mayom principles and his contemptuous understanding of the racial dynamics that governed life and death on the border. On the night of March 14th, several members of Constanzo's cult, acting on his direct orders, abducted Kilra from a street near the border, beat him, and brought him to the Rancho Santa Elena compound, where over the course of the next several hours, in a ritual presided over by Constanzo himself, Kilroy was subjected to prolonged torture before being murdered, and his body was then mutilated and dismembered in accordance with the ritual requirements, with specific body parts, including his brain and his spinal column, being removed and placed in the na-na. Kilra's remains were buried in a shallow grave on the ranch property, along with the remains of numerous other victims whose bodies had been disposed of in the same location over the preceding months and years. The investigation into Kilra's disappearance initially proceeded along conventional lines, with U.S. and Mexican authorities conducting searches, interviewing witnesses, and following up on various tips and leads, but the breakthrough came on April 1, 1989, when Mexican police, acting on a tip from an informant, conducted a raid on the Rancho Santa Elena compound and discovered a scene of horror that even the most seasoned investigators found deeply disturbing, as they excavated a mass grave containing the remains of Mark Kilra and at least 14 other individuals, many of whom showed clear signs of ritual mutilation, including the removal of brains, spinal columns, and other organs, and whose bodies bore evidence of prolonged torture before death. The discovery of the mass grave was a seismic event that generated worldwide media coverage and that forced both Mexican and American authorities to confront the reality that the violence associated with the drug trade along the border had taken a turn into something far darker and more disturbing than conventional narco-violence, as the combination of drug trafficking, wealth, occult ideology, and systematic human sacrifice represented a type of criminal enterprise that neither country's law enforcement apparatus was fully prepared to understand or to combat. The investigation that followed the discovery of the mass grave was led by Mexican authorities with significant assistance from the FBI, and it quickly resulted in the identification and arrest of numerous members of Constanzo's cult, including Sarah Aldrete, Martin Quintana, Jorge Monroy, and several others, all of whom were found to be in possession of weapons, drugs, and ritual paraphernalia linking them to the cult's activities. The arrested cult members provided detailed confessions and testimonies that painted a comprehensive and deeply disturbing picture of life inside Constanzo's organization, describing in graphic detail the rituals that were performed, the methods used to abduct and sacrifice victims, the hierarchy of the cult, and Constanzo's central role in ordering and directing every aspect of the group's criminal activities. What emerged from these testimonies was a portrait of an organization that operated with a level of brutality and systematic sadism that was extraordinary even by the standards of the Mexican drug trade, as cult members described how Constanzo would personally supervise the torture and sacrifice of victims, sometimes participating directly in the killing, and how he maintained control over his followers through a combination of psychological manipulation, drug use, physical intimidation, and the genuine fear that his supposed supernatural powers could harm those who disobeyed or attempted to leave the group. Constanzo himself, however, managed to evade capture in the immediate aftermath of the ranch raid, fleeing Matamoros with a small group of loyal followers and retreating to Mexico City, where he hid in a luxury apartment complex in the upscale Coyoacan neighborhood. Relying on his remaining contacts within the drug trade and corrupt elements within the Mexican police to shield him from the massive manhunt that was now underway. For over 2 weeks, Constanzo eluded capture, and during this period, he reportedly continued to issue orders to his remaining followers and to attempt to arrange his escape from Mexico, but his luck ran out on May 6, 1989. When Mexican federal police, acting on intelligence gathered from arrested cult members and from surveillance of Constanzo's known associates, surrounded the apartment building in Coyoacan where Constanzo and 4 of his followers, including Martin Quintana, were hiding. What followed was a tense and chaotic standoff that lasted for several hours, during which Constanzo, who was armed and who reportedly refused to be taken alive, exchanged gunfire with the police surrounding the building, and at one point, according to accounts provided by police and by one of the cult members who survived the confrontation, Constanzo ordered Quintana to shoot him rather than allow him to be captured. And Quintana complied, shooting Constanzo in the head and killing him instantly before then turning the gun on himself, though some accounts have suggested that Constanzo may have shot himself and that the details of the final moments remain somewhat ambiguous. Either way, Adolfo Constanzo died at the age of 26 in that Mexico City apartment, taking with him to the grave whatever secrets remained about the full extent of his cult's activities and the precise number of people who had been murdered in his rituals over the years. The legal proceedings that followed the dismantling of the cult were extensive and complex, as Mexican authorities prosecuted numerous individuals for their roles in the murders, the drug trafficking operations, the kidnappings, and the various other criminal activities that the cult had engaged in. Sarah Aldrete Villarreal, who had been arrested shortly after the ranch raid and who had provided testimony to investigators, was tried and convicted of multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking, and was sentenced to a prison term of over 60 years. Though she maintained throughout her trial and in subsequent appeals that she had been a victim of Constanzo's manipulation and had not participated directly in the killings, claims that were rejected by the courts but that found some sympathy among certain observers who noted that she had been a young college student with no prior criminal history when she was drawn into Constanzo's orbit. Martin Quintana, Jorge Monroy, and several other cult members were also tried and convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 30 years to over 100 years in prison for their roles in the various murders and criminal enterprises. The broader implications of the Constanzo case were profound and deeply troubling, as the case exposed in the most graphic possible terms the degree to which the drug trafficking organizations operating along the U.S.-Mexico border had embraced occult practices and ritual violence as tools of their trade, a phenomenon that was not limited to Constanzo's cult but that was, as subsequent investigations would reveal, surprisingly widespread within the Mexican drug underworld, where the use of brujos and curanderos for spiritual protection and the incorporation of elements of Santa Muerte worship, Palo Mayombe, and other occult traditions into the culture of the cartels had become increasingly common and increasingly extreme. The case also highlighted the extreme vulnerability of the populations living in the border region, particularly the poorest and most marginalized communities, who bore the brunt of the violence generated by both the drug trade and the occult practices that had become intertwined with it, as the victims of Constanzo's cult were, with the notable exception of Mark Kilroy, drawn almost exclusively from the most invisible and disposable segments of Matamoros society, people whose disappearances generated no headlines and prompted no investigations until an American citizen was killed and the full scope of the horror was accidentally uncovered. For the Kilroy family, the discovery of Mark's remains and the subsequent legal proceedings brought a form of closure, but it was a closure that was inevitably incomplete and deeply painful, as they were forced to confront not only the fact of their son's death but the horrific circumstances in which he had died, the prolonged torture and ritual mutilation that preceded his murder, and the knowledge that his body had been desecrated in ways that no family should ever have to contemplate. The family channeled their grief into advocacy, working to raise awareness about the dangers faced by American tourists in Mexican border cities and lobbying for improved cooperation between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement agencies in cases involving cross-border crime. And they also established a scholarship fund in Mark's name at the University of Texas at Austin to support pre-med students, a gesture that honored their son's academic aspirations and his desire to become a doctor. The impact on the Matamoros community was also profound and lasting, as the revelation that a mass grave containing the remains of at least 15 people had been discovered on the outskirts of their city, and that these people had been systematically abducted, tortured, sacrificed, and mutilated in occult rituals conducted by a cult that was operating with the protection and support of powerful drug traffickers, shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of the violence that the drug trade had brought to the border region and forced a reckoning with the fact that the institutions that were supposed to protect the community, including the police and the government, had been thoroughly compromised by their connections to the very criminal organizations that were perpetrating the violence. The case also had a significant impact on the academic study of new religious movements and cultic groups, as scholars of religion, anthropology, and criminal psychology sought to understand how the elements of Afro-Caribbean spiritual traditions that Constanzo had incorporated into his practice had been distorted and perverted to justify human sacrifice, and to what extent Constanzo's teachings represented a genuine evolution of Palo Mayombe or Santeria or were simply a cynical appropriation of the symbols and language of those traditions to serve his own psychological needs and his criminal enterprises, a debate that remains unresolved and that touches on deeply sensitive questions about religious freedom, cultural appropriation, and the responsibility of scholars and journalists to distinguish between authentic religious practices and the criminal exploitation of religious imagery. The narco-Satanist case also had a significant impact on the popular culture of the 1990s and beyond, as it inspired numerous books, documentaries, and fictional works that explored the intersection of drug trafficking, occult practices, and border violence, and it became a foundational reference point in the public understanding of the extreme violence that characterized the Mexican drug wars. A reference point that has only become more relevant in the decades since the case, as the violence in Mexico has escalated to levels that make the Constanzo case seem, if not exactly tame, then at least comprehensible in comparison to the mass atrocities that have been committed by drug cartels in the 21st century. For law enforcement on both sides of the border, the Constanzo case served as a stark lesson in the dangers of underestimating the degree to which occult and spiritual beliefs could serve as motivators and enablers of extreme violence, and it led to increased training and awareness among Border Patrol agents, FBI agents, and Mexican federal police officers regarding the signs and indicators of ritualistic crime, a development that has had measurable benefits in terms of the investigation and prosecution of similar cases that have emerged in the years since. The legacy of Adolfo Constanzo and his narco-Satanist cult is ultimately a legacy of horror and of warning, a demonstration of what becomes possible when the darkness that always exists at the margins of human experience is given access to the resources, the impunity, and the willing participants that the drug trade provides. And a reminder that the capacity for human beings to commit acts of unspeakable cruelty in the name of spiritual belief is not a relic of some primitive past but is a living and present danger in the modern world, particularly in those spaces where lawlessness and desperation create the conditions in which monsters like Constanzo can flourish. The names of Mark Kilra and the other victims of the narco-Satanist cult deserve to be remembered, not because their deaths were more tragic than the countless other deaths that have occurred in the context of the drug trade along the U.S.-Mexico border, but because the particular horror of their deaths, the combination of abduction, torture, ritual sacrifice, and mutilation, stands as a permanent indictment of the failure of both the Mexican and American governments to protect the vulnerable populations who live and work and travel in the shadow of the border, and as a challenge to all of us to confront the reality that evil is not an abstraction but a concrete and specific phenomenon that requires concrete and specific responses from individuals, communities, and governments if it is to be contained and ultimately defeated. Number 4. Jeffrey Don Lundgren. Jeffrey Don Lundgren was born on May 3, 1950, in Richmond, Missouri, a small town in the western part of the state where he was raised in a family that was nominally Christian but that, according to accounts provided by Lundgren himself in later years, was characterized by emotional distance, physical discipline that bordered on abuse, and a pervasive atmosphere of rigid authoritarianism that would leave a deep and lasting imprint on Lundgren's psychological development and his understanding of the relationship between authority, obedience, and violence. Lundgren's father, Don Lundgren, was a truck driver and a man of volatile temperament who reportedly subjected his son to frequent physical punishments and emotional humiliations that instilled in the young Jeffrey a seething resentment toward authority figures coupled with an obsessive need to exert control over others. A psychological dynamic that would eventually find its full and terrible expression in the religious dictatorship that Lundgren would establish decades later. Despite the difficulties of his home life, Lundgren was by many accounts an intelligent and articulate young man who performed well academically and who displayed from an early age an intense interest in religion, particularly in the interpretation of Scripture and the study of prophetic and apocalyptic texts. Interests that were initially channeled into involvement with the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a denomination that traced its origins to the same Joseph Smith-led movement that produced the Utah-based Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but which had remained separate after the death of Joseph Smith, and which had its headquarters in Independence, Missouri. Lundgren was baptized into the RLDS Church as a young man, and quickly became an active and enthusiastic member, immersing himself in the study of church doctrine, volunteering for various leadership roles, and developing a reputation as a knowledgeable and committed member who could cite Scripture with impressive facility and who possessed a natural talent for public speaking and religious instruction. His involvement with the RLDS Church deepened over the years, and he eventually secured a position as a lay minister and tour guide at the church's historic sites in Independence and in Kirtland, Ohio, a small town in Lake County in northeastern Ohio that held enormous significance in the history of the Latter-day Saint movement as the location of the Kirtland Temple, a building constructed under Joseph Smith's direction in the 1830s that was regarded by the RLDS Church as a sacred site of profound spiritual importance, and that attracted thousands of pilgrims and tourists each year. It was during his time working as a tour guide at the Kirtland Temple in the early 1980s that Lundgren began to reveal the full extent of his charismatic abilities and his capacity for psychological manipulation, as visitors to the temple repeatedly commented on the intensity and persuasiveness of his presentations and on the almost magnetic quality of his personality, which drew people in and made them feel as though they were in the presence of someone who possessed extraordinary spiritual insight and authority. Beneath this charismatic exterior, however, Lundgren was developing a set of beliefs and personal convictions that were becoming increasingly extreme, idiosyncratic, and at odds with the mainstream doctrines of the RLDS Church, as he began to claim that he was receiving direct revelations from God, that he had been chosen for a special prophetic mission that went far beyond anything the RLDS hierarchy was prepared to endorse, and that the existing leadership of the Church was corrupt, spiritually dead, and unworthy of the authority it claimed to hold. These claims did not sit well with the RLDS leadership, which viewed Lundgren's growing ego and his increasingly grandiose self-presentation with concern and alarm, and after a series of confrontations and disciplinary proceedings that stretched over several years, Lundgren was officially expelled from the RLDS Church in 1987. A development that might have been expected to end his religious career but that instead served as the catalyst for the most dangerous phase of his life. As the expulsion freed him from any remaining institutional constraints and allowed him to pursue his prophetic ambitions without interference from any authority structure other than his own. Following his expulsion from the RLDS Church, Lundgren, who was by this time married to a woman named Alice Keeler and the father of several children, began gathering around himself a small but dedicated group of followers who had been attracted to his charismatic personality and his claim to possess direct access to divine revelation, and who were willing to sever their ties to the RLDS Church and to mainstream society in order to follow him. This group, which eventually numbered approximately 15 to 20 adults and their children, initially met for worship services and Bible study sessions in various rented spaces in the Kirtland area, but Lundgren quickly began to impose a level of control over his followers' lives that went far beyond what any mainstream religious leader would attempt, demanding that they turn over their financial assets to the group, that they allow him to make decisions about their personal relationships and living arrangements, that they submit to his authority in virtually every aspect of their daily existence, and that they accept his interpretations of Scripture as the only valid and correct understanding of God's will. Lundgren's ability to exert this level of control over his followers was rooted in a combination of factors, including his genuine charismatic presence, his extensive knowledge of Scripture, which he deployed with great skill to justify his demands and to silence dissent, his manipulation of his followers' emotional vulnerabilities and spiritual longings, and the deliberate isolation of the group from any outside influences that might have provided an alternative perspective or a reality check on Lundgren's increasingly bizarre and authoritarian pronouncements. In 1988, Lundgren moved his group to a rented farmhouse on Chardon Road in Kirtland Township, a property that sat on several acres of land and that provided the physical space for the group to live communally, hold worship services, and increasingly, to prepare for the violent acts that Lundgren was beginning to tell them God had commanded them to carry out. It was at the Chardon Road farmhouse that Lundgren's ideology entered its final and most dangerous phase, as he began to teach his followers that the end times were imminent, and that God had specifically chosen their small group to play a central role in the apocalyptic events that were about to unfold, a narrative that drew heavily on the Book of Revelation, on the prophetic books of the Old Testament, and on Lundgren's own claimed revelations, which he presented to his followers with the same authoritative certainty that he applied to his scriptural interpretations. Central to Lundgren's apocalyptic scenario was the belief that the Kirtland Temple, which sat just a few miles from the farmhouse, was a sacred site that had to be reclaimed and purified through an act of ritual violence, and that this act of violence would serve as the catalyst for a series of events that would culminate in the second coming of Christ and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. A belief system that bore clear similarities to the apocalyptic ideology of other destructive cults, but that was unique in its specific focus on the Kirtland Temple and in the particular form of ritual violence that Lundgren claimed God had commanded. The specific form of violence that Lundgren began to prepare his followers for was the murder of a family named Avery, who were members of the RLDS Church and who lived in the Kirtland area, and whose selection as victims was justified by Lundgren through an elaborate and twisted interpretive framework that drew on obscure passages of Scripture, on Lundgren's own claimed revelations, and on a series of rationalizations that were designed to present the planned murders not as crimes but as acts of divine obedience that were necessary to fulfill God's plan for the end times. The Avery family consisted of Dennis Avery, who was 49 years old and worked as a supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, his wife Cheryl Avery, who was 46, and their three daughters, Trina, who was 15 years old, Rebecca, who was 13, and Karen, who was 7. The Averys were, by all accounts, a quiet, devout, and generous family who were well liked within their church community and who had no personal connection to Lundgren or his group beyond the fact that they were members of the same denomination from which Lundgren had been expelled, a fact that made them, in Lundgren's twisted calculus, not innocent people but representatives of the corrupt religious establishment that had rejected his prophetic authority, and that therefore deserved to be sacrificed as part of the ritual purification that God had commanded. Lundgren's process of preparing his followers for the murders was slow, deliberate, and deeply manipulative, as he understood that asking people to kill a family, including young children, was an enormous psychological barrier that could not be overcome in a single conversation or a single sermon, and so he gradually escalated the intensity and specificity of his rhetoric over a period of months, moving from general apocalyptic themes to more specific discussions about the need for sacrifice, to even more specific discussions about the need for human sacrifice, to finally identifying the Avery family as the specific sacrifices that God had designated. During this period, Lundgren also subjected his followers to an intensifying regimen of physical and psychological conditioning, including sleep deprivation, long and exhausting work details on the farmhouse property, strict dietary controls, and constant monitoring and criticism of any behavior or attitude that Lundgren deemed insufficiently committed or obedient. A process that systematically weakened his followers' ability to think critically, to question his authority, or to resist the direction in which he was leading them. By the early spring of 1989, Lundgren had succeeded in bringing a core group of his followers to the point where they were willing to at least contemplate the idea of killing the Avery family, and he began to make concrete plans for the murders, including the selection of a date, the preparation of the killing site, the procurement of weapons, and the assignment of specific roles to individual followers. The date that Lundgren selected for the murders was April 17, 1989, which he had identified through his prophetic calculations as having particular spiritual significance, and the site he chose was a barn on the Chardon Road property, which he had his followers clean out and prepare in advance, constructing a makeshift altar and setting up chairs in a configuration that Lundgren claimed was dictated by divine instruction. The weapon selected for the killings was a handgun, specifically a .22 caliber pistol, which was procured by one of the followers, and Lundgren assigned specific roles to several of his most loyal followers, designating who would lure the Avery family to the farmhouse, who would restrain them, who would do the shooting, and who would be responsible for burying the bodies. A level of detailed planning that demonstrated that Lundgren was fully aware of the criminal nature of what he was directing and that he was taking active steps to conceal the crimes and evade detection. On the morning of April 17, 1989, Dennis Avery received a phone call from a member of Lundgren's group inviting him and his family to attend a meeting at the Chardon Road farmhouse to discuss church-related matters, an invitation that Dennis, who was a trusting and community-oriented man, accepted without suspicion, and the Avery family arrived at the farmhouse in the early afternoon, expecting to attend a routine church meeting and having no idea that they were walking into a carefully prepared execution site. Upon arrival, the Averys were greeted by Lundgren and several of his followers and were led into the barn, where they were directed to sit in the chairs that had been arranged in advance, and it was at this point, according to the testimony provided by several of the participants at the subsequent trial, that the atmosphere shifted from welcoming to menacing, as Lundgren began to speak in a heightened, almost trance-like voice about the spiritual significance of what was about to happen and about the necessity of the sacrifice that God had commanded. What exactly passed between Lundgren and the Avery family in those final moments is known primarily through the testimony of the cult members who were present and who later cooperated with investigators, and their accounts describe a scene of almost unbearable tension and horror, as Dennis Avery, apparently sensing that something was terribly wrong, attempted to reason with Lundgren and to plead for the lives of his wife and children, while Cheryl Avery and the girls, who may not have fully understood what was happening, sat in the chairs in the barn surrounded by armed men who had been instructed by their leader to kill them. Lundgren, who did not personally fire any of the shots, gave the order to kill, and one of his followers, a man named Ronald Luff, shot Dennis Avery in the chest, and then another follower, a man named Richard Brand, shot Cheryl Avery, and then the three girls were shot one by one, with Trina and Rebecca reportedly pleading for their lives before being killed, and 7-year-old Karen, the youngest, being the last to die. After the shooting, the bodies of the Avery family were wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried in a pre-dug grave on the farmhouse property, and Lundgren directed his followers to clean the barn and to otherwise destroy any evidence of what had happened, after which he gathered the group together and, according to witness testimony, told them that what they had done was righteous in the eyes of God and that they would be blessed for their obedience. In the days and weeks that followed the murders, Lundgren maintained his grip on the group, continuing to hold worship services and to issue prophetic pronouncements, but the psychological toll of what they had done began to weigh heavily on several of the followers, and cracks began to appear in the cohesion of the group as individuals struggled with guilt, fear, and the growing realization that Lundgren's promises of divine favor had not materialized and that they were in fact murderers who had killed an innocent family on the instructions of a man who was not a prophet, but a deeply disturbed and dangerous criminal. The investigation into the Avery family's disappearance began almost immediately after they failed to return home on the evening of April 17, as friends and family members reported them missing to the Lake County Sheriff's Department, which launched a search that initially focused on the possibility that the family had been involved in an accident or had voluntarily left the area, but which quickly expanded to include interviews with members of the RLDS church community and with anyone who might have had contact with the Averys in the days leading up to their disappearance. The investigation received a critical break when one of Lundgren's followers, a man named Dennis Blair, who had not been present at the murders but who had learned about them afterward and who was increasingly disturbed by what he had been told, contacted authorities and provided information about what had happened to the Avery family and about the location of their bodies on the Chardon Road property. On April 18, 1989, just one day after the murders, Lake County Sheriff's deputies, acting on Blair's information, arrived at the Chardon Road farmhouse and discovered the bodies of all 5 members of the Avery family buried in the shallow grave on the property, a discovery that was made even more horrifying by the fact that some of the victims were still alive when they were buried. A detail that emerged during the autopsy, and that added an additional layer of horror to an already incomprehensible crime. Lundgren and several of his followers were arrested at the farmhouse and at other locations in the area in the hours following the discovery of the bodies, and they were subsequently charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and related offenses. The prosecution of Jeffrey Lundgren and his followers was handled by the Lake County Prosecutor's Office, with assistance from the Ohio Attorney General's Office, and the case quickly became one of the most high-profile criminal proceedings in Ohio history, as the combination of the religious motivation for the murders, the youth of some of the victims, and the bizarre circumstances of the cult's operations generated enormous media attention and public interest. The lead prosecutor was a seasoned attorney named Charles Colson, who built a meticulous case that focused on demonstrating Lundgren's absolute control over his followers and his direct responsibility for ordering and directing the murders, despite the fact that he had not personally fired any of the shots. Coulson's case relied heavily on the testimony of several of Lundgren's followers who agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges, and these witnesses provided devastating accounts of Lundgren's teachings, his preparations for the murders, his orders on the day of the killings, and his behavior afterward, painting a portrait of a man who had systematically manipulated a group of ordinary people into committing an act of extraordinary violence. The defense, for its part, attempted to argue that Lundgren's followers had acted independently and that Lundgren himself had not intended for the Averys to be killed, arguments that were thoroughly undermined by the testimony of the cooperating witnesses and by the physical evidence, which included the prepared grave site, the arrangement of the barn, and the weapons used in the killings. The trial of Jeffrey Down Lundgren began in October of 1990 in the Lake County Court of Common Pleas in Paynesville, Ohio. And after a trial that lasted approximately 3 weeks, the jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all 5 counts of aggravated murder, as well as on the related charges of kidnapping and gross abuse of a corpse. The penalty phase of the trial, in which the jury was asked to recommend either death or life imprisonment, focused on the question of whether the murders were the worst of the worst within the meaning of Ohio's death penalty statute, and the prosecution argued forcefully that the deliberate, planned, and ritualized murder of an entire family, including 2 teenagers and a 7-year-old child, clearly met that standard. While the defense presented evidence of Lundgren's difficult childhood and his mental health issues in an attempt to mitigate the severity of the sentence. The jury recommended the death penalty on all 5 counts, and Judge Karl Paw formally sentenced Lundgren to death in January of 1991, a sentence that Lundgren appealed through the state and federal court systems for over 15 years, during which time his case was reviewed by multiple appellate courts and by the Ohio Supreme Court, all of which upheld the conviction and the death sentence. While Lundgren's appeals were working their way through the courts, several of his followers were also tried and convicted for their roles in the Avery family murders, receiving sentences that reflected their varying degrees of involvement and culpability. Ronald Luff, who had shot Dennis Avery, was convicted of 5 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to 5 consecutive terms of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years on each count, meaning that he would not be eligible for parole for approximately 100 years. Richard Brand, who had shot Cheryl Avery and at least one of the children, was also convicted and received a similar sentence of multiple terms of life imprisonment. Several other followers received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation with the prosecution, including testimony against Lundgren and against the other participants. Jeffrey Don Lundgren was executed by lethal injection on October 24, 2006, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Ohio, at the age of 56, after his final appeals were exhausted and Governor Bob Taft declined to grant clemency. His last words, spoken shortly before the execution, were reportedly an expression of love to his family and a continued assertion of his innocence, though what exactly he meant by that assertion in light of the overwhelming evidence against him remains unclear. The broader implications of the Lundgren case were significant and were extensively analyzed by scholars of religion, psychology, and criminal law, as the case provided a remarkably clear and well-documented example of the process by which a charismatic individual can systematically break down the psychological defenses of a group of followers and lead them to commit acts of violence that they would never have considered possible before entering the group. The case was frequently compared to other cult-related murders, including the Manson family killings and the Jonestown massacre, and it was cited in the growing body of literature on destructive cults and coercive persuasion that emerged in the 1990s and 2000s, as researchers sought to understand the common elements that allowed such groups to form, function, and ultimately descend into violence. For the RLDS Church, which had since changed its name to Community of Christ in an effort to distance itself from the Mormon tradition and to emphasize its progressive and inclusive theology, the Lundgren case was a deeply painful and embarrassing episode that forced the Church to confront the question of how one of its own members could have descended to such depths of depravity, and whether the Church's own institutional structures and practices had in any way contributed to Lundgren's development or failed to prevent his radicalization. The Church subsequently implemented various reforms and safeguards designed to prevent the emergence of similar charismatic breakaway groups, though the question of whether any institution can fully protect itself against the threat posed by a sufficiently determined and manipulative individual remains an open and difficult one. For the community of Kirtland, Ohio, a small town that had always been defined to a significant degree by its connection to the Latter-day Saint movement and the historic Kirtland Temple, the Lundgren case was a traumatic event that shattered the town's sense of safety and normalcy, and that forced residents to confront the reality that the religious devotion that was such a central feature of the community's identity could be twisted into an instrument of horrific violence. The impact on the extended family and friends of the Avery family was, of course, immeasurable and permanent, as they were left to grapple not only with the loss of 5 people they loved in the most violent and senseless circumstances imaginable, but also with the knowledge that those people had been targeted and killed not because of anything they had done but because of the delusional beliefs of a man who had never met them and who had selected them as sacrifices purely on the basis of their religious affiliation and their proximity to a building that he believed had spiritual significance. The Averys were remembered by those who knew them as a kind, generous, and faithful family who embodied the best values of their faith community, and the contrast between the innocence and goodness of their lives and the cruelty and depravity of their deaths was a source of particular anguish for those who survived them and who struggled to find any meaning or purpose in a tragedy of such profound and senseless dimensions. The Lundgren case also raised important questions about the limits of religious freedom and the responsibility of the state to intervene in the activities of religious groups before those activities escalate to violence, questions that became even more urgent in the years following the case as the phenomenon of destructive cults continued to claim lives in communities across the United States and around the world. The fact that Lundgren was able to operate for years, building a following, establishing a commune, and preparing for murder, without triggering any significant intervention from law enforcement or from any other institutional authority, was cited by critics as evidence of a systemic failure to take the threat posed by extremist religious groups seriously. And it contributed to a gradual shift in public and law enforcement attitudes towards such groups that, while still far from perfect, has resulted in a greater awareness of the warning signs of cultic manipulation and a greater willingness to investigate reports of abusive or dangerous behavior within groups that claim religious protection. The name Jeffrey Don Lundgren is not as widely known as the names of Charles Manson or Jim Jones, and the murders of the Avery family did not generate the same level of sustained media attention as some other cult-related crimes, but in many ways, the Lundgren case is one of the most instructive and disturbing examples of the phenomenon, as it demonstrates with extraordinary clarity how a single charismatic individual, armed with nothing more than words and will, can take a group of ordinary people and transform them into killers, and how the combination of religious conviction, psychological manipulation, and apocalyptic ideology can produce a form of evil that is as total and as devastating as anything in the human experience. The 5 members of the Avery family who died in that barn on Chardon Road on April 17, 1989, deserve to be remembered, and their deaths deserve to be understood, not as the inevitable consequence of some abstract social or psychological process, but as the specific and preventable result of the specific choices made by specific people, chief among them Jeffrey Don Lundgren, who chose to use the power that had been given to him not to heal or to build but to destroy, and who in doing so destroyed not only 5 innocent lives but the lives of everyone who loved them and everyone who was touched by the ripples of horror that spread outward from that barn in Kirtland, Ohio, into the wider world. Number 5. Daniel Perez, also known as Lou Castro. Daniel Perez, whose true identity remains a subject of uncertainty and investigation to this day, was a man who appeared in the Kansas City, Kansas area in the late 1990s under the name Lou Castro and who, over the course of approximately a decade, constructed a small but deeply destructive cult-like group that revolved entirely around his claim to possess extraordinary spiritual powers, including the ability to heal the sick, predict the future, communicate with angels and the dead, and perform miracles that could cure diseases, resolve financial problems, and protect his followers from any manner of harm. Claims that were delivered with a level of confidence and charisma that proved devastatingly effective at attracting and retaining a small but devoted following of individuals who were, for the most part, experiencing various forms of personal crisis, including illness, financial hardship, relationship difficulties, and spiritual searching, and who were therefore uniquely vulnerable to the type of manipulation that Perez specialized in. The true identity of Daniel Perez has never been definitively established, as the name Lou Castro was a pseudonym, and Perez himself provided contradictory and unverifiable information about his background, origins, and past to different followers at different times, telling some that he was from South America, others that he was from the Caribbean, and still others that he had a background in special operations or intelligence work, a pattern of deception about his personal history that is extremely common among cult leaders and that serves the dual purpose of creating an aura of mystery and danger around the leader and of preventing followers from independently verifying the leader's claims or uncovering information that might undermine their authority. What is known about Perez is that he was a smooth-talking, physically unremarkable man who compensated for his lack of striking physical presence with an extraordinary ability to read people, to identify their deepest fears and desires, and to construct elaborate narratives that positioned him as the answer to whatever problem they were facing. A skill that he deployed with ruthless effectiveness over the approximately 10 years that he operated in the Kansas City area, building a group that at its peak consisted of approximately 15 to 20 adults and their children, all of whom lived in a series of rented houses in the Shawnee County and Wyandotte County areas and all of whom were subjected to varying degrees of financial, emotional, physical, and sexual exploitation. Perez's methodology for recruiting and retaining followers was a textbook example of the techniques of coercive persuasion that have been identified by researchers who study destructive cults, as he typically made initial contact with potential followers through informal social settings or through referrals from existing members, and he would then begin a process of what might be called love bombing, in which he would shower the prospective recruit with attention, praise, and apparent concern for their well-being, while simultaneously gathering detailed information about their personal history, their vulnerabilities, and their emotional triggers, information that he would later use to manipulate and control them. Once a recruit had been drawn into the group, Perez would begin to escalate his demands, asking them to contribute money to the group, to participate in increasingly bizarre rituals, to distance themselves from family members and friends who expressed concern about their involvement, and to accept his authority as absolute and unquestionable. A process that was facilitated by Perez's practice of isolating group members from outside influences and by his creation of an internal culture in which any expression of doubt or dissent was treated as a spiritual failure that would result in divine punishment. Perez justified his authority and his demands through an elaborate spiritual belief system that he constructed from elements drawn from Christianity, New Age philosophy, folk Catholicism, and his own invented mythology. And that centered on the claim that he was not merely a spiritual teacher or healer but was in fact a divine figure, or the representative of a divine figure who had been sent to earth to carry out a specific spiritual mission that required the absolute obedience and sacrifice of his followers. This belief system was reinforced through regular group rituals that Perez led, which included prayer sessions, faith healing ceremonies, speaking in tongues, and various other practices designed to create an altered state of consciousness in the participants and to reinforce their emotional dependence on Perez as the source of their spiritual experience and their connection to the divine. The financial exploitation of group members was systematic and severe, as Perez demanded that followers turn over their paychecks, their savings, their property, and in some cases their homes to the group, and he used these funds to support a lifestyle for himself that was significantly more comfortable than the austere conditions he imposed on his followers, while also using the money to maintain the group's rental properties, to purchase vehicles, and to fund his own movements, as Perez was known to travel extensively and to maintain a degree of physical mobility that allowed him to stay one step ahead of any questions or concerns that might have been raised about his activities. The physical and emotional abuse of group members was also pervasive, as Perez maintained control over his followers through a combination of psychological manipulation, public humiliation, physical punishment, and the constant threat of spiritual consequences for disobedience, including the loss of salvation, divine punishment, and the invocation of curses and hexes that Perez claimed to be able to place on those who defied him. The most disturbing aspects of Perez's criminal activity, however, were the sexual exploitation of group members and the murders that he committed or ordered, as the combination of sexual predation and lethal violence represented the ultimate expression of the power that Perez had constructed for himself within the group and the ultimate betrayal of the trust that his followers had placed in him. The sexual exploitation was extensive and targeted multiple victims, including both adult women and children, and it was facilitated by Perez's spiritual authority, as he framed sexual relations with himself as a spiritual practice or a divine requirement that was necessary for the follower's spiritual advancement or for the fulfillment of a specific spiritual purpose. A technique that has been employed by countless cult leaders throughout history, and that is particularly effective when the followers have been psychologically conditioned to accept the leader's authority as absolute, and to interpret any feelings of discomfort or reluctance as evidence of spiritual weakness rather than as legitimate warning signs. The children within the group were especially vulnerable to this type of exploitation, as they had been raised within the group's belief system from a young age and had no framework for understanding that what was happening to them was not normal or acceptable, and Perez took advantage of this vulnerability to commit acts of sexual abuse against multiple children over a period of years. Acts that would eventually form the basis for some of the most serious charges brought against him. The first murder that was definitively linked to Perez was the killing of Deborah White, a woman who had been a member of Perez's group and who died under circumstances that were initially attributed to natural causes but that were later determined to have been the result of foul play, though the exact details of White's death and the precise manner in which Perez caused or contributed to it remain somewhat murky. As the investigation into her death was complicated by the passage of time, the reluctance of other group members to cooperate with authorities, and the difficulty of reconstructing events that had occurred within the closed and secretive environment of the group. The murder that brought Perez to the attention of law enforcement, and that ultimately led to his prosecution and conviction, was the killing of Patricia Hughes, a 38-year-old woman who had been a member of Perez's group for several years and who had become one of his most devoted followers, turning over significant amounts of money and property to the group and participating fully in the rituals and practices that Perez prescribed. Hughes had reportedly begun to express doubts about Perez and his teachings in the period leading up to her death, a development that Perez reportedly viewed as a serious threat to his authority and to the cohesion of the group, and which may have been the primary motive for her murder. Though the exact sequence of events that led to her death and the precise role that spiritual or occult beliefs played in the killing remain subjects of some debate and interpretation. What is known is that on or about June 17, 2003, Patricia Hughes was drowned in a swimming pool at a residence in Shawnee County, Kansas, and that her death was initially investigated as a possible accident or suicide before evidence emerged that pointed to homicide, including witness testimony from other group members who eventually cooperated with investigators and who described the circumstances surrounding Hughes's death in terms that contradicted the initial narrative of an accidental drowning. According to the testimony provided by these witnesses, Hughes's drowning was not an accident but was rather a deliberate act that was carried out as part of a ritual or ceremony that Perez had designed and directed, and that involved holding Hughes under the water in the pool until she drowned. An act that was presented to the participants as a spiritual purification or a test of faith, but that was in fact a straightforward act of murder carried out to eliminate a follower who had become a liability to Perez's control over the group. The investigation into Hughes's death was led by the Shawnee County Sheriff's Office, which initially faced significant challenges in building a case against Perez, as the witnesses who might have been able to provide direct testimony about the killing were either still under Perez's influence and unwilling to cooperate, or were terrified of the consequences of speaking out against a man whom they had been conditioned to believe possessed supernatural powers that could harm them even from a distance. Over a period of several years, however, investigators were able to gradually build trust with some of the former group members and to piece together a comprehensive account of what had happened to Patricia Hughes and of the broader pattern of criminal activity that Perez had engaged in during his years operating in the Kansas City area. A process that was facilitated by the departure of several group members who had become disillusioned with Perez and who were willing to provide testimony to law enforcement once they had been freed from his immediate psychological control. The investigation was also greatly assisted by the work of forensic experts who examined the evidence related to Hughes's death and who were able to provide testimony that supported the conclusion that the drowning was a homicide rather than an accident, including evidence about the position of Hughes's body in the water, the absence of signs of a struggle that would have been consistent with an accident, and the presence of injuries that were consistent with having been held underwater by another person. In 2009, approximately 6 years after Patricia Hughes's death, Daniel Perez, who was then 53 years old, was arrested and charged with a staggering array of criminal offenses, including first-degree murder in the death of Patricia Hughes, first-degree murder in the death of Deborah White, multiple counts of aggravated criminal sodomy related to the sexual abuse of children within the group, multiple counts of sexual exploitation of a child, multiple counts of endangering a child, and various counts of fraud and theft related to the financial exploitation of his followers. The trial of Daniel Perez began in 2010 in the Shawnee County District Court in Topeka, Kansas, and it was a proceeding of extraordinary scope and complexity, as the prosecution was required to present evidence spanning approximately a decade of criminal activity and involving multiple victims, multiple types of crimes, and a pattern of behavior that was as bizarre as it was disturbing. The lead prosecutor built the case methodically, beginning with the financial exploitation of the group members and using that evidence to establish the pattern of manipulation and control that Perez exercised over his followers, before moving to the sexual abuse of the children, which was presented through the testimony of the victims themselves, who described in devastating detail the abuse they had suffered at Perez's hands and the psychological mechanisms that Perez had used to prevent them from reporting the abuse or resisting it, and then finally presenting the evidence related to the murders of Deborah White and Patricia Hughes, which was the culmination of the prosecution's narrative and which was designed to demonstrate that the manipulation, exploitation, and abuse that Perez had engaged in were not separate or unrelated acts but were rather components of a single, comprehensive pattern of criminal behavior that had as its ultimate expression the taking of human life. The testimony of the former group members who cooperated with the prosecution was particularly devastating, as they described in detail the inner workings of the group, the methods Perez used to recruit and control followers, the rituals he conducted, the financial demands he made, the sexual abuse he perpetrated, and the specific circumstances surrounding the deaths of both Deborah White and Patricia Hughes, providing the jury with a window into a world that was almost incomprehensible in its cruelty and depravity. The defense, for its part, attempted to challenge the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses by pointing to inconsistencies in their accounts and to the difficulties of relying on testimony from individuals who had been subjected to years of psychological manipulation. And they also attempted to argue that the deaths of White and Hughes were not murders but were rather tragic accidents, or the results of the victims' own actions, arguments that were undermined by the weight of the evidence presented by the prosecution and by the sheer number of independent witnesses who corroborated each other's accounts of Perez's behavior and his direct role in the killings. After a trial that lasted several weeks, the jury found Daniel Perez guilty on all 27 counts against him, including the 2 counts of first-degree murder, the multiple counts of aggravated criminal sodomy and sexual exploitation of a child, and the counts of fraud and endangering children, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 50 years on the murder charges, plus over 100 additional years on the remaining charges, all to be served consecutively, ensuring that Perez would never be released from prison. The broader implications of the Perez case were significant, particularly in the context of the law enforcement and judicial system's understanding of and response to the phenomenon of destructive cults operating in smaller communities and in less visible settings than the large, high-profile groups that tend to attract media attention. The Perez case demonstrated that a single charismatic individual operating in a relatively low-profile manner in a Midwestern metropolitan area could, over the course of a decade, commit an extraordinary range of crimes, including murder, child sexual abuse, and financial fraud, without attracting significant outside attention or intervention. A reality that spoke to the continuing difficulties that law enforcement agencies face in identifying and investigating cultic groups that operate below the radar and that are effective at concealing their activities from the surrounding community. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of children to exploitation within cultic environments, as the children in Perez's group were subjected to sexual abuse that was not only horrific in its own right but that was compounded by the spiritual framework within which it was presented, which prevented the children from understanding that what was happening to them was wrong and prevented them from seeking help from outside the group. The impact on the victims of Perez's crimes was profound and enduring, as the adults who had been financially and emotionally exploited were left to rebuild their lives from a state of near total devastation, having lost their savings, their homes, their social connections, and in many cases their families as a result of their involvement with Perez. And the children who had been sexually abused were left to cope with the long-term psychological consequences of that abuse, consequences that included post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, difficulty forming healthy relationships, and a shattered sense of trust and safety that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The families of the murder victims, Deborah White and Patricia Hughes, were also left to grapple with the knowledge that their loved ones had been killed not by a stranger in a random act of violence but by a man whom they had trusted and followed, a man who had used their faith and their hope against them in the most fundamental way possible. And this knowledge added a particular dimension of anguish to their grief that was compounded by the difficulty of understanding how such a thing could happen and why it had not been prevented. The Perez case also raised important questions about the responsibility of communities, neighbors, social services agencies, and law enforcement to be alert to the signs of cultic activity and to intervene when those signs are present. As the decade-long reign of Daniel Perez in the Kansas City area was made possible in part by the reluctance or inability of the people and institutions surrounding the group to recognize what was happening and to take action before the situation escalated to murder. The fact that Perez was able to operate for 10 years, exploiting and abusing his followers, sexually assaulting children, and ultimately killing 2 people, without being stopped by any external authority, is a sobering reminder that the threat posed by destructive cults is not limited to the large, well-known groups that dominate media coverage of the phenomenon but extends to the countless smaller, less visible groups that operate in communities across the country and that are capable of inflicting enormous harm despite their relatively small size and low public profile. For the Kansas City community, the revelation of what had been happening within Perez's group was a shocking and disturbing experience that forced a reckoning with the fact that the type of extreme cultic behavior that most people associate with distant places or distant times could in fact occur in their own backyard, in ordinary neighborhoods, in rented houses that looked no different from any other houses on the block, and that the perpetrators of such behavior could be people who appeared, on the surface, to be ordinary and unremarkable. A realization that is both terrifying and necessary if communities are to develop the capacity to recognize and respond to the warning signs of cultic abuse before it is too late. Daniel Perez remains incarcerated in the Kansas prison system, serving the life sentence without possibility of parole for 50 years plus the additional consecutive years that were imposed for the other crimes, and he will almost certainly die in prison, an outcome that, while it provides a measure of justice for his victims, cannot undo the harm that he caused or restore the lives that he destroyed during his decade of manipulation, exploitation, abuse, and murder. The names of Patricia Hughes and Deborah White deserve to be remembered, not only as victims of a particular criminal but as representatives of the countless individuals who have been drawn into destructive cultic relationships, and who have paid the ultimate price for their trust, their hope, and their willingness to believe that the answers to their deepest questions and their most desperate needs could be found in the promises of a man who was not a healer or a prophet but a predator who used the language of spirituality as a weapon. The children who were abused by Perez also deserve to be remembered, not by name, in order to protect their privacy and their ongoing recovery, but as a permanent reminder of the particular and terrible vulnerability of children in cultic environments and of the absolute imperative that all adults, in all communities, bear a responsibility to protect the children in their midst from those who would exploit their innocence and their trust for their own twisted purposes.